What if the strongest part of your leadership wasn't your skill set, but your culture? What if the very things you once hid, downplayed, or adapted out of yourself were actually the foundation of how you build, work, and lead? You're listening to Blueprint and Soul, a podcast about building from the inside out. I'm your host, Sal Carter. And today we're talking about why culture is infrastructure. Not decoration, not personality, but structure. Load-bearing, foundational. And to get there, I want to take you back to a moment that shaped everything for me. First management job was in high school, running shifts at a fast food restaurant. I was young, frustrated, trying to lead a team while barely knowing who I was myself. One day, I came home exhausted. My grandmother sat me down, took my hand, and said, "More important than trying to get an immediate result is building up the team around you. Everyone brings their own story to the table. Use yours to connect. Empower people to go beyond expectations." That moment stuck with me because she wasn't giving me managerial advice. She was giving me cultural wisdom, leadership born from lived experience, community, and resilience. I didn't know it then, but that was the first time I learned that culture is infrastructure. Let's expand this, because this isn't just about my grandmother. This is about what happens when culture becomes the blueprint of how you show up. Let's talk internal architecture. I want to dive into the reality of culture as a structural system, because culture is not extra. Culture is a building system inside every one of us. It shapes how we interpret the world, how we lead, how we navigate conflict, how we build trust. Here's an example. My first corporate job, I walked into rooms where no one looked like me. No one talked like me. Even when I dressed professionally, I still felt wrong. I adapted. I reshaped my voice. I tried to blend in because I thought that was the cost of being taken seriously. But adaptation is a tool, not an identity. That point was really driven home years later when the VP at that same company looked at me and said, "There are hundreds of people here who look the part and talk the part. But your advantage is your ability to genuinely connect through your experiences and to solve problems uniquely." For the first time, I felt seen. Not for how well I assimilated, but for the culture I carried. This really resonated with me. It's something that I try to incorporate into the way that I led in the future. And it wouldn't be long before I had an opportunity. I inherited a team that was labeled as low talent, unmotivated, and already had been written off. Using cultural wisdom, listening deeply, learning people's stories, understanding what shaped them, I built trust. I empowered them. And together, we exceeded expectations. Not because I forced them into a new system, but because I built with them, not over them. That's when it clicked. Culture isn't a nice thing to have. Culture is infrastructure. It is the internal architecture that shapes external performance. If this is resonating with you right now, take a screenshot, share it, send it to someone who's navigating their own identity at work, or just pause and reflect. I'll give you a moment. Where does your culture show up in your leadership? And where have you been taught to hide it? All right, guys, let's keep going. I want to leave you with 3 blueprint tips that changed the way I led, all rooted and culture. Blueprint tip number 1. Identity is a leadership advantage. When I learned to stop shrinking myself to fit a blueprint someone else created, my leadership changed. I became more confident in hard situations, more grounded in conflict, more creative in problem solving. Because identity provides instinct, intuition, and perspective. It lets you see people as human beings, not just roles. Blueprint tip number 2. Adaptation is a tool, not a replacement. You can adjust your communication style, your tone, your strategy, but those adjustments should be an extension of who you are, not erasures. Think of it like editing a drawing. You refine the details, but the blueprint is still yours. Tip number 3. Culture builds teams faster than any strategy does. The underperforming team that everyone doubted, they transformed because I led with cultural wisdom, listening, connecting, understanding motivators, bringing shared values to the front. Culture creates trust, and trust creates results. And now I want to bring in someone who lives this truth every day. A leader who understands culture is both a strategy and a structure. Let's welcome our guest for today. Today we're joined by Shari Davis, a human capital strategist, executive coach, and founder of Venture HCM. She is a cultural architect, someone who spent over 20 years helping executives and organizations transform how they lead by transforming the way they treat people. She works at the intersection of culture, performance, trust, and people-centered leadership. And today, she's here to help us explore why culture is infrastructure, not just in theory, but in practice. Shari, welcome to Blueprint of Soul.
Sal, thank you so much for the invitation. I am so looking forward to this conversation, and I love the name of the podcast, and so I'm very interested in pursuing what we're going to talk about today.
So with that said, let's jump right into the heart of this episode. When you hear the phrase, culture is infrastructure, what comes up first for you? How does the idea land with the work that you do?
Now, that's a great question. When I hear the phrase culture is infrastructure, my mind goes instantly to all the places we show up in our lives, right? So whether it's our workplaces, professional organizations we might be a part of, social clubs, and even the organizations where we volunteer our time, right? In every one of those environments, there's what I consider to be this universal truth that culture just doesn't appear because someone says, this is who we are, right? I like that you've connected this whole concept of infrastructure to this topic. I have, some strong feelings connected to that. And what I know to be true from my personal as well as my professional experience is that culture, whether you consider it to be healthy or not, is shaped and it kind of grows out of the infrastructure that's underneath it. So when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about things like, the systems and the processes and the policies and those kind of unspoken standards that tell people how things really work in an organization, right? It's like, do we have clear expectations, or how do things like really get done? How do decisions get made? What kinds of behaviors and outcomes are actually rewarded or tolerated? And so all of these, I think, influences what I like to refer to as the psychology of culture, like how people feel, how they experience the environment, and how they work together. This is really what becomes the culture. So when I think about culture as infrastructure, I think of it as what's visible and invisible in terms of the architecture, right? Because that really holds everything up. And whether that architecture is considered strong or whether it's considered shaky determines the kind of environment people get to thrive or struggle in. So that's how I think about culture and its connection to infrastructure.
I think that that's very much in line with, the concept of your internal blueprint. The organization is very much a reflection of a collection of
Mhm.
internal
Mhm.
blueprints.
Mhm. Mhm.
The way
Yeah.
that shows up in the workspace shows up in a relationship, in the way that we relate and interact with each other and show up in the outside world, because the facade is only held up
Mhm.
by what we build inside.
What we want people to see.
And so, with that said, can you share a moment from your own journey, personal or professional, when you realized that culture, whether personal or organizational, was quietly driving everything? And what shifted for you?
Okay. So yes, I can pinpoint an exact moment when I realized culture was kind of quietly driving everything. So I spent more than, 20 years in a global organization and had a great career there. I grew from being a human resource generalist to a vice president and was really fortunate to work there during a time when organizations were what I consider, right? So I'm talking from my experience, were
Mhm.
actively investing in people centered policies and development. And leaders made choices. They made like real choices. They put time and money and energy into growing their people. And the business thrived because of it. But over time, there were economic and political the landscape kind of shifted, right? And so did the culture. I started to experience that and I felt it. So as an HR leader and a strategist, I mean, I'm no stranger to reorganizations or having to plan or implement tough transitions, right? That all kind of comes with the job and the territory. But under kind of like this different C-suite that we had, the approach to people and how we manage people decisions really changed dramatically. The expectations about how we were supposed to carry out certain decisions and actions really started to look different.
Hmm.
They were impersonal and pretty much, I think, felt completely misaligned with the values that we said we stood for, like as an organization and as a leadership team. And I remember kind of like it was yesterday, I was sitting around the conference room table with my peers, the leadership team, the HR leadership team, and we were looking at each other and saying out loud, this isn't right. The culture had shifted kind of underneath us and we knew things were changing, but it became pretty undeniable about what was happening. And that was a tipping point for me. It went against kind of who I was, both as a person and a professional, and I knew I didn't really want to be part of a culture that treated, these practices and the ways in which we are being asked to do them as normal. And, shortly after that, I actually was no longer with that organization. And I think that experience really set the course for the work that I do now. So I became a consultant because I wanted to partner with organizations that, they could see the tension between people and culture and strategy, but still have the vision and the courage and commitment to navigate that tension in a thoughtful way, right? And in an intentional thought, well, not always easy, but
Right.
right, but in a thoughtful way. Organizations that want to, do right, even when business pressures make it hard, is what motivates me and the work that I do. And so that whole realization of that experience changed everything for me. And it's the reason I'm so passionate about working with organizations to build cultures where people can thrive and the organization can succeed too. It doesn't have to totally be this either or, right? More compromise of one to the other.
That's interesting story. I think, it definitely lends to insight that even as leaders, sometimes we don't have that same type of perspective of decision makers
Hmm.
within the organization. I think that there is an inherent disconnect a lot of times where we tend to forget that, to your point, people drive organizations. People are its core, its foundation. So even as leaders or management, we don't always have that concept of decision makers are people.
Yes.
There are
Yes.
HR specialists who are sitting at this conference table who are like, hey, this does not align with my internal culture. This does not align with who I am.
Yeah.
We just sort of think about how it makes us feel.
Right.
So you often say culture is strategy because people drive possibility. How do you explain that to leaders who still see culture as something separate from the real work?
That's actually an interesting question, because a lot of the work that I do, especially if we're talking around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and things of that nature, what leaders necessarily may not understand is just really culture work, right? I mean, that's really all that it is. And so when leaders tell me, or imply, or I'm picking up on, right, that is separate from the real work, and I'm, use quotation marks there, right? I remind them that an organization can try to execute a strategy without paying attention to culture, but it almost never gets the result it hopes for, right? Because culture, quietly determines everything that happens in between those bullets, those nice bullets that are on the strategic plan document, right? And culture drives how decisions actually get made and what behaviors are rewarded and what behaviors are tolerated. How quickly an organization can respond to change, because that's, in corporate every year we were reorganizing and changing and realigning the portfolios, all of that kind of
Don't
stuff
I
that
know?
happens, right? How people collaborate with each other, and what accountability looks like, right? And so really culture, it becomes like this operating kind of system. And if that operating system is misaligned, even the most kind of brilliant strategies are going to stall, or they're going to fail. And so when I say culture is strategy because people drive possibility, what I mean is strategy doesn't create outcomes, people do. Okay, and I'll just say that again. Strategy does not create outcomes, people do. So people interpret the strategy, they decide whether to lean into it or to resist it, right? They choose whether to innovate, or I'm just going to play it safe because this is just another change that's going to happen, and that leader's going to be gone, that strategy is not going to matter kind of thinking. And it also, people either stretch the organization's capabilities to kind of meet that strategy and the vision and things of that nature, or they hold it back, right? And so that's what I mean when I say, strategy doesn't create outcomes, people do. So from my perspective, leaders need to understand and believe that people drive possibility. We are kind of like that human engine of performance and transformation. So when you invest in leadership and building capabilities and psychological safety and collaboration, all those things we talk about, and we provide clarity around what the purpose is. That's how you expand what's possible. So you could
I agree.
create this environment where the strategy can actually take root, right? So organizations move kind of at the speed of relationships and trust and clarity, not at the speed of a strategic plan document.
And so when we talk about stated strategies and values, it makes me wonder for you, what are
Mhm.
some of the early indicators, the red flags, that an organization culture isn't actually aligned with its stated strategy or values?
Okay. Well, there could be several things. Focus on a couple that come to mind.
Okay.
Um, the first one I would describe as behavior vision gap. So leaders say one thing and they model something different, right? And so team members notice pretty quickly the real rules versus like the stated values, right? And then their behavior adjusts. Engagement's going to drop, right? Initiative, innovation kind of slows down. People begin to protect themselves, right? Instead of pushing the work forward. So that's one indicator that I've seen quite a bit. You also will see kind of like this increased behavior of workarounds. So you might have formal systems that are just not functioning, right? And people then start to create these shadow structures. It also could be relationship driven too, because if you have a couple of leaders that aren't collaborating and partnering strongly, then that, of course, that then cascades down into the organization, right? And so people start working around each other to get something done because now they're in survival mode. So they might bypass processes or roles just to get stuff done. And then, I guess another one that comes to mind is the energy level. You'll see a decline in the energy level. So people, they may be working hard, but they're not really making maybe meaningful progress or what that looks like in action as as teams are trying to work together. So the strategy execution may feel heavy. You hear people say, I don't know why they set these goals. This isn't realistic. We can't get this done, whatever, however that may manifest itself. So I think the bottom line is that when culture is weak or misaligned, people shrink like that possibility that we're talking about, right? They do the minimum, or they're protecting their turf, or they're avoiding risk. And that's why I think this question is such an important one for leaders to ask themselves, right? About, seeking, is there alignment, is there misalignment in the culture? Ask themselves as well as their peers, right? I really think it helps kind of diagnose the culture, the connection between what the culture is and how people in the organization is performing, and if there's also any kind of systemic kinds of issues that are happening that signal that change needs to happen.
Well, speaking of why we do what we do, right?
Okay.
Think about your own identity and lived experience. How does that inform the way you coach, design strategies, and hold space for leaders?
Well, I love this. I love this question because I love talking about this topic. Because when we talk about culture, leadership, strategy, again, right? We already said we're talking about people. And the truth is, none of us walk into a room alone, right? So we bring in our identities, our experiences, and the stories that kind of shape who we are as individuals. And so for me, that means, and I share this openly in spaces, when I'm doing training and coaching and things of that nature. For me, that means I show up as a Black cisgender woman, baby boomer, a Christian, an empath, what I consider to be an empath leader, and someone who has spent my career, as you said, in the introduction, kind of at this intersection of human capital management and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? And so those identities aren't separate from my work, even my personal life, actually. Okay. They inform how I engage with leaders and organizations and how, I design a strategy or how I create space for others. So, I mean, when we kind of talk about identity, so I grew up in New York City in Harlem. And so I was surrounded by diversity every day, whether I was, walking or engaging in the neighborhoods, you work every other neighborhood, something else is happening, right?
Yep.
Traveling to school or work on the subway, listening to the different, languages and the experiences. So I really developed a great appreciation for different perspectives and kinds of ways of being. And then I kind of moved into, my career and my senior leadership roles. And a lot of times I was the only person of color or maybe the only woman sitting at the table or in the space. And in those spaces, I've experienced microaggressions, right? Related to my physical appearance or my intellect or my experience, even though it was equivalent to other people sitting around the room, right? And then those inequities that also kind of come for many that come from traditionally kind of underrepresented groups. And those moments really taught me something powerful, right? You can be very capable, deeply committed to your craft and whatever's happening, right? And qualified and still be unseen, underestimated, because of systems and decisions that weren't designed with you in mind, right? And so learning to kind of navigate that while staying grounded in my own kind of understanding and knowing my worth and my values really kind of help shape the ways in which I advocate for myself and others in the work that I do, how I lead and how I even support my clients today. So, I mean, I'll say in a heartbeat, my work is fundamentally about humanity. So, whether I'm coaching a senior leader or facilitating a team or I'm like leading an assessment or a strategy project, right? I really focus on creating what I want to be inclusive spaces where people feel valued and respected and safe to be honest about who they are and what they need to grow, because it's all different. And it also helps us understand how we can support each other, right? When you can kind of create that space. So all of my engagements have some level of what I like to call community agreements, right? It kind of sets a tone for how we're going to listen to each other, right? How we're going to honor each other's experiences, and how we will engage and be in courageous kind of ways, right? In respectful and courageous kind of ways. And I encourage the leaders to do that the same. I be open, be willing to learn and unlearn, and the term I like to use is seek to understand before being understood. We all have something to say.
That's a
Okay.
word.
Do you know what I'm saying?
That's a word.
But you need to be quiet, sometimes, and not be talking. So, because that's really, in my opinion, where the real growth happens, and when we hold space for both the similarities and the differences that shape us. So my lived experience doesn't sit like on the sidelines of my work, is really embedded in how I hold space and how I support people in organizations so that people can thrive and the missions can happen too. So that's a lot about my lived experience, but that's pretty much how it shows up in my work and how it's impacted why I do what I do, or it has influenced why I do what I do.
Well, I am glad that you have gained this wisdom to share with us, your lived experience. It's really one of those hearing that makes me think of experiences I've had in the past, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have had. I've been in a room where I myself may have been the only person of color, but also been in a room where there may have only been one female of color, right? It's sometimes, I think sometimes we miss the advocacy part of it when it comes to people in general. We tend to think of it more in a sense of just race when we talk about advocating, being an ally. In the more recent season of my career, I found myself having to be more of an ally and speak up for women in the workplace. So, that's something that I wanted to point out just as an experience that I've had that I want listeners to really be aware of and be conscious of. When you talk about your experience, that it's not an out of the norm experience.
No, it's not.
In the present times, we tend to immediately jump to one thing or another when we talk about advocacy, when we talk about diversity and inclusion. We tend to forget that it doesn't include this or that. It
Right.
includes all of it. It
It
includes
it does.
everything, because culture is
Yeah.
not just one thing or the other. Our culture is defined by so many different
Yeah,
things.
and it also can depend also too on the type of organization, right? Because if I'm working with an organization that let's just say IT, not that it's completely male dominated, but if you're working in an environment that happens to be a male dominated industry, right? And then the norms become kind of male oriented, right?
Sometimes it's unconscious bias.
Yes, right. It just kind of happens that way. So it's important. So I coach a lot about also too recognizing that there's probably a majority culture that has happened naturally. You might not have necessarily intended it to be, but that's why you have to be intentional to make sure that you are bringing in and creating the space for other perspectives to be present.
Earlier in my career, working in the construction field, especially when you're talking a lot of labor jobs, your mind immediately thinks a bunch of burly guys pouring
Yeah,
concrete, working with tools. But there are a lot of really good tradeswomen, laborers, specialists,
project
project
managers.
managers that can do any and everything that their male
Yes,
counterparts can, are just as good. So when you think of, well, what are the common sense rules or what are the common sense practices, you don't always take into account that, hey, at some point or another, there's going to be someone different here. There's going to be someone who isn't a male in this space. And we need to make sure that this is the space that allows them to do what they do well.
I've seen it happen geographically too. very different culturally, different lived experiences, things of that nature. And even just from a geographic perspective, kind of trying to bridge that culture and that identity and the priorities and what's important for some and how people process things differently and experience things differently. So to your point, no, it's not just all about one thing.
Yeah, I think, yeah, yeah, and it's just eye-opening to hear your perspective and your experience in that space. Even for somebody who I like to think myself a little seasoned, been around the block once or twice, but there's always something to learn, and there's always ways that we can improve ourselves and the way we show up in the world. You do a lot of work at the intersection of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, leadership, and accountability. What does a people-centered, equitable culture look like and feel like in practice? Because we all know on paper what he says. What does that look like?
Yeah. I just snicker because this is such a common kind of conversation, especially that's happening now. But I think a truly people-centered, equitable culture, to your point, is something that you see, feel, and experience like every day, right? They're not, the values that are like shared in the organizational spaces and the documents and the presentations and stuff like that. And so I think it looks like this clarity, this consistency, this fairness, right, that is built into like the everyday kind of system. So leaders and employees can point to where equity kind of is structurally embedded in things. They see and feel the sense of kind of intention and fairness about things, and it's transparent. It's not like left up to interpretation, even though we're all going to process things differently, right? So there's the expectations, the decisions are transparent, and okay, they make sense. So that's kind of how I think it looks. It feels like trust.
That's the big one. That's the big one.
A sense of, and I'm not sure this is a word that we probably use a lot, like in organizational conversations, but kind of dignity, belonging. So they feel heard or valued, right? They feel safe to kind of challenge ideas without fear of retaliation. People feel respected for what we talked about earlier, their identity, their perspective, their expertise. And they feel a level of confidence that their contributions that truly matter. So that's how it feels. Okay. So, how it looks, how it feels. And then when you kind of think about how it functions around accountability, like leadership accountability, that's me as a leader, you as a leader, modeling that inclusive behavior we're talking about, right? We're going to hold ourselves and others accountable for the culture, because I don't just work with leaders, I work with teams too. So we all contribute to it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And it also thinks about, well, how do we repair trust if something happens? There's a certain level of accountability and responsibility when you're in leadership, right?
Makes a lot of sense that when you are actually doing the work, when your strategy is reflected not just in a memo or a handbook, but in the way that we hold ourselves accountable, the standards and values that we hold others to as a organization, as a company, as a leader. When it's done really well, even celebrated for your unique perspective, for your individuality.
It also connects back to how we started with the whole idea about, culture being strategy, the focus on the people.
Yeah, I mean, that's so layered and such
It
a
is.
powerful thing from a personal standpoint, but from a business standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, it is such an essential thing. It becomes the foundation of what we build. When we build a company, when we build a team, that is structure. That's
Yeah. And the other thing connected to this too is that when organizations have stakeholders and boards and whatever, and then You have what I mentioned earlier, the economic and the political landscapes, and how that might also influence the expectations of leaders, right? Of C-suite leaders and things of that nature.
There's some of our listeners who don't have big titles, but they care deeply about culture. Um, what's one small thing they can start doing tomorrow that actually makes a difference?
Okay. So, for anyone listening who doesn't have big title, but cares about culture, I say that there's some good news. You don't need a title to make a difference. As we've been talking about, culture is shaped in like those everyday moments, right? So how we speak to each other, how we listen, how we show up, and we've been talking about that. And one of the most powerful things you can start to do, like, now, tomorrow, is being inclusive. And I'm saying being, right? Because that's active, being inclusive in your kind of daily interaction. So this means being willing to kind of step out of your comfort zone a little. So, lean into those conversations or perspectives that feel unfamiliar, or may even, bring up certain feelings or whatever, because we all, have our experiences, or, good, bad, or indifferent, that follow us, along our journey. And so really just slowing down some long enough to say things like, tell me more. You're in a conversation, right? Tell me more about, what you're sharing, or can you share more about how you see that approach being implemented so we can get the results that we need, right? Versus, because a lot of times we're in our heads thinking about, I don't know what that person's talking about. I can't wait till they stop talking so I can say what I would need to say, that kind of thing, right? So that's what I mean about being inclusive, is just slowing down and kind of leaning in and asking, some of those open-ended kinds of questions that get you to really understand what other people's perspectives are. First of all, they're going to see that you care. Okay.
Ask me questions,
Right?
so show me
Right.
you want to know.
Yeah, I would. Right. Exactly. And I think those moments also help us build what is referred to as like cultural humility, right? So that helps us to understand the people around us more deeply, and it creates spaces where those others feel valued, and they are respected. So this kind of conversation often brings up for me um, a really well-known quote by Maya Angelou. That quote says, "People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel."
Mm,
Okay. And I think that that's true, right?
yeah.
So you may not have a big title, but you absolutely have the power to shape how people feel in your presence. Okay. And when people feel seen or heard or included, that contributes to the culture. So there's like small actions, and this takes practice, right? I mean, we're sitting here, we're having this wonderful conversation, but again, and I use the word intention a lot, right? It's kind of, it's for me, if you ask me a question, I always have an answer. I always have a thought, right? But I've had to train myself to almost like sit on my hands and be like, I'm not going to be the first person in the room to speak, or, I'm going to actively listen.
And that's an acquired skill.
Yes, and you have to practice that. And those kinds of things shift environments, right? So no matter what role you're in, that is something that you can do. But it's a skill, it's intention, it's practice.
It's not about titles and positions.
Mm-mm.
It's about intentions and decisions. I heard a phrase once, I think that it's kind of in line with that, is cultural collaboration. That is how you collaborate authentically.
Yeah, yeah. And not all of us, some of us are introverts. I'm an introvert, right? Some of us are introverts, some of us are extroverts, or whatever. I mean, I guess that plays a role as well in why space is important. Creating space is important.
I mean, you're going to work with all type of people, different type of personalities, and some cultural indicators are much more easy to spot than others.
Yeah.
You know, we may not know the reason why. Shari doesn't always want to talk, you know, and it's not because Shari doesn't like us. It's not because
Right.
Shari has an attitude or
Right.
that's just, you know, oh, you know how they are.
Right.
No, it's Shari's actually an introvert.
Right.
She's not saying much because she's actually listening. She's
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
understand our perspective. Where are we coming from? You know, why do we feel the way that we feel about a particular thing? So yeah, sometimes you like you said, slow down.
You
Slow
do.
down.
And some people are processors. I mean, you know, I have one colleague, I know she's a processor. So when we're talking about something like, you know, I'm comfortable with just giving out my initial thoughts about things. And I can see on her face, she's processing. So I create the space for her to process. I'm like, and I'm not like, oh God, I wish she'd like say something.
I had to learn it.
That's right. You have to learn that, right?
How do you personally stay grounded? You
Hmm.
do work in culture and transformation, and that work, that's very nature. Emotional work, it can be
Mm-hmm.
emotionally charged. And in the world we live in now, currently, it also can be very politically heavy and
Mm-hmm.
politically charged. We know of all the professional things, all the
Mm-hmm.
how-tos and whatnots
Mm-hmm.
of the professional world, but
Mm-hmm.
you personally, how do you personally stay grounded?
Yeah, yeah. That's actually essential to the work that I do and folks that do similar work because we're human too, right? So one of the things that really sustains me is my community. So I have a circle of professional colleagues and friends as well that I can talk to openly without filters. And they help me kind of process the hard times. They help me, you know, we celebrate the good times and reminds me that I'm not carrying this work alone. I also lean deeply on my faith. So before I go into any session, I take a moment and pray because I never know what dynamics, what emotions, what histories, right, I'm about to step into. And so I ask God to go before me, to kind of center me, to kind of let me be a light for whatever a person or a group may need in the moment, because I don't know, right? I know what I have been hired to do, okay? And that the people that hired me know what I'm going to do, right? But I'm also engaging with, you know, a lot of different people. And so, you know, that ritual, just in terms of, you know, prayer brings me a sense of kind of peace and clarity. And it reminds me that I'm guided. I'm not, you know, grinding and trying to push through this whole thing and figure out, you know, all the what ifs about things, right? Because that would drive me nuts.
I could imagine.
Yeah, it would drive me nuts. And I also hold close to this guiding philosophy that has inspired me by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, all labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance and should be undertaken in painstaking excellence. Okay. And that reminds me about like why the work matters. And me and my colleagues talk about this, right? After a session, we'd be like, whew, okay, that was a lot. But the fact that we have a partnership, you know, really helps in that. And especially when it feels heavy. And, you know, and to be honest, I mean, you know, also as a Black woman in this country, I get triggered too. There have been times after a session, I call a colleague and I'll be like, you won't believe what this person said. But but I'm also constantly learning and unlearning, right? And so holding space for others means I have to be intentional about getting the support that I need. So if that's therapy, prayer, reflection, time with people just you know not even related to my work. So those are all the things that ground me. It's not just one thing. It's kind of like, you know, that connection, faith, reflection, and care that allows me to keep showing up in integrity, having empathy, you know, having some level of clarity about why I'm doing what I'm doing.
I can appreciate, and I am a strong proponent for reinforcing your foundation, recognizing those support beams that are going to hold you up.
Mhm.
No matter what kind of work, it's important to reflect. It is important to have your values, your belief, your faith help you get through, like, especially in moments where you're not even sure you're going to get through.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that looks a little different in different scenarios.
it
Sometimes
does.
it's a physical sense where I don't know if I can do this.
Yeah.
Other times it's a professional sense of, I don't know, I'll still have a job after this conversation, right?
Yeah.
In order to construct that blueprint and to grow, it requires us to do a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, it does. And one of the things too also is that because of the kind of work that I do, sometimes I'm not sure that people really understand what they're asking me to do. And so I'm always also clear about making sure that my client knows what it is I'm going to do and say and why. And that we have open conversation about that because I'm also very much, I mean, I'm in support of their success, right? But because of the kind of work that I do, sometimes people don't know what they don't know.
I
They
can,
just know they need
yeah,
something.
I have a general
I have a general
idea of what
idea.
you do ish.
Right, right, right.
But I,
Yeah, so I'm always gonna have
yeah,
some kind of walkthrough. I'm always gonna have something, right, to also get their feedback, and because I also want to make sure I'm aligned with, their culture, their ways of being, because I also don't like to be used, maybe, right? And so the whole culture thing, there's no reason for me to come in and do certain kinds of work, and people are just gonna look at me and say, "Are you kidding?"
that's
Because that is so counter what our culture actually is. I'm just not taking a job to be taking a job, right? There has to be some level of alignment about who they are, who I am, what they want to get done. And we have very open and transparent conversations because, and this has never happened because I don't want anybody to come back to me and say, I can't believe you said X, Y, and Z and you did X, Y, and Z.
I mean, I think that it is important that there's that level of transparency, that
Mm-hmm.
there's that level of engagement, commitment, and willingness on both sides to meet each other where we are, right?
Yeah.
What's genuinely your culture? What is it that you would like to see and accomplish here?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also, here's how I go about it. Here's
and
how I
and
develop.
and I have to model, right? So that's where also the prayer thing comes in, right? Because I want to be an example. I can't come into spaces and be messy.
That's true. Be authentic
I
unto the
have to be
message.
right, but respectful, and I have to model when I'm what all the things that we've talked about. I have a responsibility and accountability about how I show up, right? So that I'm training them to do the same.
Where can our listeners find you, work with you, or learn more about Venture HCM?
Okay. Well, first, I want to thank you for having me in this conversation. We've had the opportunity to have similar conversations in the past, so this has been a great opportunity to continue that. If anyone listening who would like to learn more about my work or explore, how the organization Venture HCM can support, their leadership, their team development, their org strategy, culture, they can connect with me on LinkedIn, Shari Davis, or send me a note at shari@venturehcm.com. And if anything that we talked about, resonated with you, any of the listeners here, please don't hesitate to reach out because, I'd love to continue the conversation. So I just so appreciate you, Sal, in this platform.
Sherry, thank you again for being here. Your voice, your insight, your leadership is powerful. Really appreciate you sharing that wisdom. And before we wrap for episode 2, let's take a breath. I want to share with you guys your reflection for this week. Your culture is not ornamental. Your culture is not a footnote. Your culture is not something to hide. It is structure. It is strength. It is strategy. So ask yourself this week, what part of your cultural blueprint needs to be honored more deeply? And how would your leadership shift if you stop apologizing for it? Sit with that. Let it speak. Thank you for joining me for episode 2 of Blueprint and Soul. If this episode moved you, share it with someone who needs that reminder. Culture builds leaders. Please join us next week for episode 3, The Table as a Blueprint. We'll be joined by a special guest, Kareem Mr. Bate Queenman. Make sure you follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts and on IG at Blueprint and Soul. And until next time, build with intention and lead with soul.